Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. We'd like to welcome everybody to Chai Chats. Chai Chats is a program where we offer chai, cookies, and conversations that are going to be relevant for the RCM community and make better informed decisions about these issues that we have to face in our society.
So we bring in experts, people in the field, and we hope to educate our community and to empower our community, inshallah, to be able to carry on real conversations that are happening outside in our workplaces, in our schools, and just outside the walls of the masjid. So tonight we're here to explore the question, what does justice ask of our brothers, ending domestic violence with this generation?
First and foremost, we'd like to make dua for Lester Douglas, the Executive Director of Men Stopping Violence, who was our original guest. He could not be here. He's recovering from a recent surgery. But in his stead, we do have Mr. Sulaiman Nurridin. Mr. Sulaiman Nurridin is a recently retired staff instructor with Men Stopping Violence, for whom he continues to teach a class to men arrested in DeKalb County for misdemeanor family violence charges.
So please welcome Mr. Sulaiman Nurridin. Yes, sir. I can help you with it. All right.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
First of all, let me acknowledge that I want to acknowledge my brother Hugh for inviting me here to be here this evening, and to you for the work that you do in creating a forum like this. I believe that the issue of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, male violence against women is very serious in our community, and creating forums like this for us to have a conversation is very meaningful because knowledge and awareness is so important. Just a little bit about Sulaiman Nurridin. For a little over 30 years now, I have worked directly with men, teaching and educating men about how we can be in relationships and not have to use aggressive or abusive behavior. I've been trained as a therapist, a counselor, an educator, and so I do a lot of that work. And in doing that work, I've listened to the voices of thousands of women, not only nationally but internationally, about what it is to be in relationships with us. Because it's been your voices that has informed the work that we do. And I want to respect and honor that. In addition to that, I have a private practice. The woman in my life, Myra, and I, my wife, have a private practice where we do a lot of work with couples, teaching and educating couples about what it is to be in relationships and how to navigate through growing moments. And so that's a little bit about who I am and how I come into the world. Recently, just retired from Men Stopping Violence, and I was the director of men's education. And presently, I do a contract with MSV where I do work in the DeKalb County court system with work with men, which I would love for you to come see and witness. Yeah. So that's a little bit about I.
Awesome. Well, let's get right into it. Would it be a mistake to say that most of the violence we see in the world is perpetrated by men? What is wrong with us?
That's a great question.
I heard laughter only from one side.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I get that. For a moment to just think about this country here in the United States. When I think about this country and when the European first came here, he brought with him what was called British common law. British common law served as the foundation for the criminal legal system that we are governed by today. And in British common law, there was a law that said a man could not beat his wife with an instrument larger than the base of his thumb. And it was called the rule of thumb. And if you ever go look at some of the old black and white movies, you see men walking around with canes and the women were walking right next to him. It wasn't about he had a problem with his stride. It was there for a purpose, and that purpose was to keep her in line. From the state of North Carolina, and up until about 30 years ago, well, let's give it a little bit more, maybe 40 years ago. In the state of North Carolina, there was a law in the books that said a man could not beat his wife on Sunday out of respect for the Sabbath. So you have these kinds of laws throughout this country. And of course, they've begun to change now. And when you begin to think about the voices of women, it was not until the late 60s, early 70s, that women's voices were beginning to be heard in this country. Because women broke the code. You know the code that what goes on in this house stays in this house? You don't air your dirty laundry in the streets. Women broke that code, and they began to tell their personal stories. And as they began to talk about their personal stories, all of a sudden this became a political issue. And it was focused on men, how we are showing up. And that's been, how can I say, the labeling of it in terms of men and how we look at this whole issue of power, control, dynamics, and what does that mean for us in a relationship.
So, as Muslims, with the example that we have through
Yes.
our Prophet and our teachings,
The hadith of Aisha where she mentions that the Prophet, peace be upon him, never ever struck a woman or a servant or a child. Muslim men must be doing better in this regard, right?
Well, I don't know if that's a trick question or not, but I want to say that what I've learned in the years of doing this work, Imam, is that there are no socioeconomic limitations. There are no boundaries. All men can make the choice to use violence, the threat of violence, emotional, psychological, economical, sexual abuse to get their ways in a relationship. All men do that. And all men can make the choice. Not that all men do it, but all men can make the choice to do it. So who am I to say it doesn't happen over here and it does happen over here?
yeah. A little bit about your organization that you work with.
If you could, please tell us what happened 35 years ago and what role Men Stopping Violence plays to address this violence.
You know, the issue of domestic violence was really big in the early, let's say in the 1980s. The issue began to really take some fun on. And the name was domestic violence. Domestic violence doesn't really give credence to what it really is. It says domestic is violence that goes on behind closed doors. Men Stopping Violence began to name it and say it's male violence that's going on behind closed doors that we need to address. And so in 1982, two men came together and under the leadership of a woman by the name of Kathleen Collin, and they created MSV. Men Stopping Violence has primarily focused or got its start in DeKalb County. It has served Metro Atlanta in the work that we do, and we have over the years established an amazing relationship in DeKalb County. However, we are really known for the training that we do. We have been in over 44 states in the United States, 7 countries outside of the United States, talking about this work, meeting with organizations, community groups, higher education, civic organizations, talking about what it is to bring men together to begin to talk about this issue with the belief that when men stand up and say this kind of behavior is not acceptable, that it's not tolerated, we will not allow it in our communities, things begin to change. So how do we do that? By educating and teaching. So we do a lot of work around training. We also have programs that accompany that. We have a 24-week educational program that I personally say is for good for every man. I have not, in my years of doing this work, met a man who could not benefit from coming to the program. And so it's not saying you have to be a batterer or you have to be someone that is using emotional or psychological abuse against someone. It's good for every man. And so we spend a lot of time teaching and education and training. We also have side programs like a community restoration program for men who have completed the 24-week program who want to do more with the organization. And they serve in this capacity to do things like legislation work. When the legislation comes up, they go down and lobby with legislators and talk to them about the laws that really affect the lives of women and what we can do to support changing those laws. We also have other organizations, things like Because We Have Daughters, and we also have other community interventions.
Could you go into that a little bit? So there's a couple of programs here that we were interested in you talking about. There's one, Because We Have Daughters, and the Batterers Intervention Program.
Because We Have Daughters is quite a unique program. I'll never forget, several years ago, Shelley Sedaley, who is executive director, came to us and said, what can we do? How can we get men involved with Men Stopping Violence who are not being abusive? Men who are not using emotional or psychological behavior. How do we get them involved? And the idea came up because we have daughters. Every man wants his daughter to grow up in a safe environment, to grow up free from harm. And so what we decided to do was to create a program where we bring fathers and daughters together in a day-long program where there are activities where dads and daughters connect together. I mean, as men, we spend a lot of time with our sons, but how many of us spend quality time with our daughters? You know, and really taking time to be with them. So we created a space. And it's an opportunity for dads to learn how to listen to their daughters, how we learn to respect their non-traditional ways of thinking, how do we begin to connect with them through communication in a very different kind of way. So it's a program that we've done, and we also do training around that. We could come here and do a training here in the masjid for the fathers about how to do this.
Sounds like a good plan. Elizabeth, you heard that, right? Where is he? He's over there. And the batterers intervention program, is that the 24?
That's the 24-week program, yeah.
What is the role for accountability in how MSV operates, and to whom are your programs accountable?
We have our accountability, first of all, we do with ourselves. Okay. We have weekly accountability meetings where we talk about how we're showing up in the world, the work that we're doing, how we're connecting with the community and the work in the community. However, we also have, all of our work is open to women. So women come and observe our work, and they give us feedback on how we're doing. How are we connecting with the men in our classes? How are we doing within our trainings? How are we listening to their truths and their realities? So our accountability is done that way. We also have a board, a board of directors that's headed by a woman who actually leads and takes care of our, our organizational runnings too. So the voices of women are very important to us. In the early days, before women were allowed to come see our work, we used to tape every class. And we would take the tapes of our classes to women organizations so that they could listen to them and come back and say, well, Sulaiman, this is something you should do differently. You should change this, tweak that. There should be more accountability here, you know, and looking at those kinds of things. And so that's a little bit about it.
Excellent.
But there's also a level of accountability for the men who come through the program.
Okay.
And I should say a little bit about that. Accountability is extremely important at Men Stopping Violence. I believe that if we as men are going to ever change our behavior, the first step is that I have to take responsibility for what I've done. And I have to take responsibility without minimizing, denying, justifying, or blaming. Because as long as I can use either one of those things, there's not taking any responsibility. In addition to being able to take responsibility by naming the behavior that I've used, I also have to look at how that behavior has impacted or affected others. You know, not only just the immediate family, but also the community that we live in. Because I believe that behavior grows bigger than just in the home. Yeah. The other part of that is how do I then begin to reestablish a sense of trust, a sense of honor, a sense of respect, a sense of spirit that I took when I did that behavior. How do I reestablish that, and what's the plan of action for that? So a lot of that goes into the accountability for men.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing, and please, you're going to stay with us as we continue our conversation. But I do want to introduce another guest that we have with us tonight. And we're already familiar, the RCM community at least should already be familiar with the work of Noor Family Services. Our next guest is an attorney in a solo practice who has successfully litigated many high-conflict divorces and custody disputes. She provides legal services to Noor Family Services and their clients. And we would like to welcome Fakiha Khan. There she is.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Salam.
So, Sister Fakiha, for our audience today that may not be familiar with Noor Family Services, could you just give us a little bit of introduction or a little bit about what Noor Family Services does and your specific role with your organization?
So Noor Family Services is, for all intents and purposes, a domestic violence and legal services organization. We started in late 2015, basically to fill a gap in the domestic violence organization paradigm. We have a lot of great organizations in Georgia that do great work for victims of domestic violence. We just don't have one that's focused on the specific needs of immigrant and specifically Muslim communities. There was a real gap of services that were provided, and we found that there were DV victims who were from a Muslim faith or an immigrant faith that weren't necessarily seeking services because they didn't know where to go, essentially. So that's where the organization started off. And what we have done is to really try to have a holistic approach to domestic violence services. So we provide the traditional services where if a victim comes to us and says, we need protection, we need a safe place to live, we need counseling services, we provide all of those. Those are, that's the groundwork of what a DV victim in the emergent stages needs. Then the second phase of what we do is to provide legal services. So we provide pro bono legal services, not just to obtain a temporary protective order, but what happens after the temporary protective order. So a lot of victims will be able to go and go to court and get a temporary protective order against their batterer, but what they can't do is control or really even defend themselves when it gets to the next stage. How do you go get a divorce? How do you ensure that you get child support? How do you co-parent with somebody who's been abusive? For example, this is a really big problem. Yeah. And it becomes compounded when you are working with victims who have limited language proficiency, so they don't necessarily speak English. And it becomes even further compounded when victims come from, for example, the Muslim community, where there are certain practices, there are certain cultural norms that you have to both get past and kind of bend a little bit in order to really protect the children and to protect the victim in that situation. Then the third part of the program, which I think is actually the most important, is the education and outreach program. So we don't just want to help victims who are suffering from domestic violence now. We don't necessarily just want to go in and fix the problem after it's occurred. We want to stop the problem before it begins. So we have made it a goal, specifically for 2019 especially, to go out and really reach into the communities, to really reach out both to victims and to potential batterers and to the bystander, really to educate about what is domestic violence, how do you recognize it, what does it mean from within the cultural norms that you are familiar with, and how do we sort of have that conversation and prevent this from getting to a point where families are breaking up, where you have men in jail and you have single moms working $10 an hour trying to support 3 children without child support. That's not the ideal, so we want to prevent that from happening. So in a nutshell, that's what NFS does. Yeah, and I'm the attorney, so that's what I do.
So no doubt you're on the front lines of this, and I understand the reason, part of the reason we've been pushing this conversation forward. There's a domestic violence khutbah drive that groups like Noor Family Services, Muslim Wellness Foundation, they sponsor, reach out to us to make sure that we talk about this. And one interesting bit of information that came to me, this was really shocking, was in Ramadan last year, and Sister Shama shared this with me, and that was that in the month of Ramadan, you were getting more complaints of domestic violence incidents in Muslim homes. Whereas it's supposed to be a month of control, self-control, and this kind of stuff, and then it was really shocking to hear. But from what you heard from Mr. Nurridin as well, from your perspective, is there a role for programs like Men Stopping Violence, and what limitations do they have?
Absolutely, because it is organizations like Men Stopping Violence which will play that part in preventing this from happening. Because the cycle has to break, and the cycle, it's not the ideal place for the cycle to break after the violence has happened. The ideal place for the cycle to break is before the violence begins. And so I think groups like Men Stopping Violence are integral to being able to change those sort of cultural norms, to change the way we think about it, to really shift that paradigm for everyone in this room, myself included. So yeah, absolutely.
And what more do you think groups like Men Stopping Violence could do? You have right here.
Well, right now, Men Stopping Violence is in 44 states. We can get to 50.
Yes,
we can get to 50 states and 193 more countries. That's right. But I think the coordination with other groups is really important. That community outreach is really important. I think that the work that you guys are doing is great, and we should just use that as a foundation and build upon it.
Excellent. And you mentioned the bystander.
Yes.
Which is really interesting. And so we have a video.
For everybody here, I want to share a brief video of Dr. Jackson Katz discussing what he calls the bystander approach. Can we roll the tape, please?
We focus on all of us as what we call bystanders. And a bystander is defined as anybody who is not a perpetrator or a victim in a given situation. So in other words, friends, teammates, colleagues, co-workers, family members, those of us who are not directly involved in a dyad of abuse, but we are embedded in social, family, work, school, and other peer culture relationships with people who might be in that situation. What do we do? How do we speak up? How do we challenge our friends? How do we support our friends? But how do we not remain silent in the face of abuse? Now, when it comes to men and male culture, the goal is to get men who are not abusive to challenge men who are. And when I say abusive, I don't mean just men who are beating women. We're not just saying that a man whose friend is abusing his girlfriend needs to stop the guy at the moment of attack. I mean, that's a naive way of creating a social change. It's along a continuum we're trying to get men to interrupt each other. So, for example, if you're a guy and you're in a group of guys playing poker, talking, hanging out, no women present, and another guy says something sexist or degrading or harassing about women, instead of laughing along or pretending you didn't hear it, we need men to say, hey, that's not funny. That could be my sister you're talking about, and could you joke about something else? Or could you talk about something else? I don't appreciate that kind of talk. Well, the bystander approach is trying to give people tools to interrupt that process and to speak up and to create a peer culture climate where the abusive behavior will be seen as unacceptable, not just because it's illegal, but because it's wrong and unacceptable in the peer culture. And if we can get to the place where men who act out in sexist ways will lose status, young men and boys who act out in sexist and harassing ways towards girls and women, as well as towards other boys and men, will lose status as a result of it, guess what? We'll see a radical diminution of the abuse, because the typical perpetrator is not sick and twisted. He's a normal guy in every other way, isn't he? Now, among the many great things that Martin Luther King said in his short life was, in the end, what'll hurt the most is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. In the end, what'll hurt the most is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. There's been an awful lot of silence in male culture about this ongoing tragedy of men's violence against women and children, hasn't there? There's been an awful lot of silence. And all I'm saying is that we need to break that silence, and we need more men to do that. Now, it's easier said than done, because I'm saying it now, but I'm telling you, it's not easy in male culture for guys to challenge each other, which is one of the reasons why part of the paradigm shift that has to happen is not just understanding these issues as men's issues, but they're also leadership issues for men. Because ultimately, the responsibility for taking a stand on these issues should not fall on the shoulder of little boys or teenage boys in high school or college men. It should be on adult men with power. Adult men with power are the ones we need to be holding accountable for being leaders on these issues. Because when somebody speaks up in a peer culture and challenges and interrupts, he or she is being a leader, really, right? But on a big scale, we need more adult men with power to start prioritizing these issues. And we haven't seen that yet, have we?
So what did you mean, though, when you were saying, sorry, Mr. Nurridin.
No,
What did you mean? And maybe you can define it for the audience here. Who is the bystander?
Well, what I meant by it is that what I find time and time again when a client comes to me and they've been suffering essentially silently for decades sometimes, but certainly years, what I find is that there's a sense of isolation. There's a sense of, I can't talk about this, A, because I'm going to be judged, B, because no one's going to believe me, and C, because I am going to suffer the negative consequences, right? So what I take from that is we need to be able to support that individual in being able to articulate their needs. And the best way to do that is to be the bystander who can actually stop what's happening, right? So we within the Muslim community, myself included, we have a real tendency to want to say, oh, they're fighting, I'm just going to turn this way and pretend that it's not happening, right? Yeah. Because that's supposed to happen behind closed doors. It makes us uncomfortable. It makes everybody uncomfortable, by the way. This is not a Muslim problem. This is not a female problem. It's not a male problem. It is beyond culture, beyond boundaries, and beyond religion. It is uncomfortable to see that happen. And our instinct is to just turn around, turn away from it because we don't know what to do. But I think those are the moments where we have to act. We have to be the person who says, hey, ma'am, do you need some help? Can I provide some support? Or for a man to be able to say to another man, hey, you know what, maybe you shouldn't talk to your wife like that. Maybe you shouldn't talk to your child like that. And we simply don't have that. It is so sort of antithetical to the way we approach community. We really need to get to a point where we don't shy away from it just because it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, and it's profound that you kind of put it in that way, and just kind of is a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ where he called out the men in his community after receiving complaints from women, and he addressed them in a gathering, and he said to them, he says, what is wrong with you? What is the matter with you that you would treat your wives in this way? And so he did address it directly with the congregation when they were all gathered in the presence of men and women. And so
and we should take example
have.
from that.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Sulaiman, Nurridin, would you like to add anything on the subject?
I'd like to add just a little bit more to it.
Yeah.
You know, when I stop and think about it, how many times have we in our communities seen a situation, recognized something where we saw a man assaulting a woman? It could have been raising his voice. It could have been looking at her in a certain way. It could have been hand language. It could have been language. We saw it and we did nothing. We walked by. That's a man taking care of his business. You don't interrupt that, and you're the business. You see, we no longer can afford to do that, men. It's your voice that makes a difference. How do you begin to say no? Now, I'm not talking about putting yourself in harm's way. No, that doesn't help anything. But if you see something, how do you interrupt it? Do you interrupt it from afar by bringing your voice in? Do you look around and say to the security officer over there, there's something going on, you need to check in? Do you do a 911 call? What do you do to interrupt it? There are 5 daughters in my life. 5 daughters. And I want you to know, man, I want to know that there are brothers out there that's going to interrupt. I want the daughters in my life to be safe. That's why I challenge us to step up to the plate. How do we show up? Bystanders. We can no longer afford that luxury. It's time for us to make a difference, and each one of you have the opportunity to do that. How do you have a conversation with another brother and say, let me tell you something I've learned about myself, and begin to share a story that might make a difference in their life? How do you confront a man based on information you got from a woman and not use her name? How do you have that conversation? Create a level of accountability. How do we as men come together for that and begin to do that? You can do that and make a difference to create safety for women and girls so that they can grow up and experience their whole humanity without having to worry about being assaulted in any kind of way. Don't be a bystander.
Thank you for that. 2 very interesting perspectives. Sister Fakiha, one more, not just one more. The Me Too movement, right? And so we had the hashtag Me Too movement where women were sharing stories about when they were harassed. And to be quite honest, and I think our community needs to know this, women in our community personally shared their stories, not just maybe in public through social media, but also with me personally. That this is something that affected them when this happened. I did ask, and I did receive some disturbing stories. And there's even stories I can tell you from even before the hashtag came out of what women were complaining about, the things that they were going through in social gatherings and this kind of stuff.
Began to see articles published by Muslims about their experiences of groping and sexual assaults even while performing the Hajj. It seems that Me Too is making demands of our brothers, and not just those whose behavior has been its focus. For those of us who would assert, but not every man, or who would claim, but I would never do that, can you clarify the message that we should get from this movement?
I think the biggest message that I take away from the Me Too movement is to not allow the victim, or to allow the victim a safe space to talk about what's happened, and to share that story and to share those feelings, because otherwise they're going to do what all of my clients do, which is suffer in silence and feel isolated. And beyond that, that should be a jumping point for, frankly, the assaulter or the abuser to stop and say, what is it that I'm doing wrong? How is it that I am affecting this person? How can I be better, right? And I think that's our obligation as human beings, period, to figure out how can we be better. That's why we're on this earth, right? How can we be better? And for me, the Me Too movement is about that. It is both for the victim to feel validated in her feelings, or his feelings, but then also for us to look at ourselves and say, how can we prevent this from happening in the future?
It's very, very important for us to, I think, to kind of realize this, because some of these complaints that come from the Muslim community actually came when people were at Hajj. And it's something we have to realize, that women have complained of being groped, and we all know the environment, those of us that have been to Hajj, how cramped of an environment that is. And even I have gone twice myself, and I've seen things myself. And so this is also important for us to recognize that this is as Mr. Nurridin says, a chosen behavior. Even in the most holiest of places for us, it's something that was a shock to witness and a shock to hear about as well. Dr. Katz has said, you want to add something, please?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I feel like it's really important to recognize here as well that there is a spectrum of behaviors, right? When we normally think of, I think a lot of people, when they think of Me Too, they're thinking of the worst end of the spectrum, right? I mean, there is physical contact that is completely unwanted, and somebody has forced themselves on the other person. But there's so much more on that spectrum, and I think it's really important to recognize for a lot of, and I don't want to pick on just the men, but I will. But I think it's really important for a lot of men to realize the limits of the space that you occupy, right? And because we as women, I will say, we're very conscientious of the space that we occupy. We are very conscientious of, how we're going to sit and how we're going to dress and how we're going to interact with somebody else. But as men, and I have brothers, I have a father, I've got two boys. I see how we treat them differently. I see how boys are taught to not have that awareness for their own space. And I think it's really important to sort of recognize when we're doing that and to create those boundaries so that we can prevent it from happening in the future. Because while the extreme end is absolutely unacceptable, all of the stuff that goes in the middle is also unacceptable.
Sulaiman, did you want to add
That
something?
makes a lot of sense to me, okay? Because when you look at the continuum, and over on one side you've got all the physical stuff.
Yep.
You've got the emotional, the psychological, all that stuff on the other end. And who's to say what is worse? For the person who is being looked at, who is being groped, the abuse is the same. There's no difference. And we're not the ones to say, oh, well, that wasn't so bad. Come on. Once again, it was the voices of women that spoke out about this. Men didn't bring this to the table. No man brought up and said, hey, let me tell you about the physical abuse or the sexual abuse that's being done to women. We didn't bring it. It was the voices of women that brought it up. And this is recent. All these years that's been going on. Finally, the Me Too movement steps out and creates something. And all of a sudden now we're beginning to look at how have we shown up in relationships? What have I said? What have I done? How have I looked and touched and done all the different things? How do we begin to educate men about this? What is sexual abuse? What is sexual violence? What does that look like? And the first thing men say, well, rape. Come on, that's one, yes. But there's a whole litany of stuff.
Yeah.
And how do we begin to talk about that and educate men about that?
Dr. Katz has said pornography normalizes the men's pleasure taking as it sexualizes the woman's degradation.
And this is a topic that's very, 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 very not discussed in our community, right? But yet it has a profound impact on our community, and especially when we look at the statistics, and we did some studies a while back, about the use of pornography in the Muslim world. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but you will be surprised. You will be surprised. Given the fact that in many Muslim countries, pornography websites are blocked by the government, yet they're still accessed at high rates. And so,
What has pornography to do with all of this, and what does justice require of us?
Well, how much time do we have? Pornography, I think is, how am I going to answer this? Okay, I don't know that it is to blame. I think it is a symptom of a larger problem. That larger problem is about control, it's about power, and it's about objectification. It is about what we teach our daughters and what we teach our boys, right? That we are teaching our boys that your relationship to the opposite gender is one of desire and objectification of the other. So what that does is it desensitizes half of the population to the fact that there are feelings involved with the other half of the population. So what do you do when you have an object? What is it? What does that mean? What does it mean to objectify? What it means is you think that that object is there for your use, it is there for your pleasure, it is there for your abuse, it is there for your discipline, and it does not have, it is an it, right? It does not have feelings or thoughts or depth or desires or opinions, and if it does, then you have to beat it out of it, right? That's ultimately what we are talking about.
Wow.
That power and control dynamic is what needs to change. So the way I see it is, pornography is just another symptom of that. It is geared towards men. It is about what a man would find pleasurable, and it can be an array of things, right? But it is all about how is the audience, the male audience, being pleased here. And that objectification, that is the problem, right? That is the problem right there.
Exactly.
I hope I made sense when I talked
Oh,
about
very good, very good. May I just add a word?
Please.
Pornography is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. If you take all the cinemas, all of them, and put them together, they don't make the money pornography makes. And it's available. I mean, you turn on your computer, you don't have to invite it. Sometimes it invites you. It's there. And it's all about the objectification of women, seeing women as objects to be used however we choose to use them. And that's what it is. It's an addiction, too. It's very hard to stop. It's very hard to stop. Years ago, Men Stopping Violence put in place, and we said to the men, we want you to bring all of your pornography into the classroom. Now, we took a stretch. We didn't know that men would do anything. The following week, I went into the class, and in the center of the room, there were 8 boxes. Videotapes, magazines, books. Men were bringing stuff in. It has to do with the belief I have that when we ask men to do things, when we teach men about things, they begin to change that behavior. At the end of that class, while I was real clear with the men for what they did, I said to them, I want you to go back home now and bring that one piece that you held on to. Because I know you didn't bring it all. And I was saying that with some humor, but that was also intentional. Part of MSV is that men have to take all of the pornography out of the home. Take it a step further. If you're into pornography, what is your relationship with your partner, your wife? When you're having that intimate moment with her, that connection with her, what video is playing in your head? You deny yourself the opportunity to be fully engaged with the person you profess to love and care for. If you're struggling with it, acknowledge your struggle, men. Don't be shameful behind it. Let go of the guilt. Use the shame and guilt to empower you to do something different. Connect with the imam, connect with another brother and say, look, man, I'm struggling with this. I need help. And that's the first step to changing it.
It is, and we do have resources available to help our community.
You can
And
also
there's-
talk to your partners about it. Just saying.
There you go.
Talk to your wives too.
Just-
Let
just
them know
something
what you're struggling with.
Absolutely. Just some quick facts about this as well. And I think recently Masjid Furqan did a program. They hosted a program somewhere where they did discuss this issue in detail. You know, there are some very, very disturbing facts, and we have to be aware of them, especially as adults and parents in this room. We have to be very, very aware of the access to pornography. Number one, the age is getting younger and younger and younger.
Yes.
I know in my time, it was probably maybe like high school that kids were talking about, oh, I saw this video, I saw that video, or, pornography. As low as 5th grade, elementary school, kids have access because they have these devices in their hands. They have a lot of access to a lot of things. Kids in elementary school are getting access to pornography. There was a study done in Australia, and in Australia they found that it was not in Australia, but the study was in Australia, but it was a study on girlfriends and boyfriends, right? Middle school age girlfriends and boyfriends, and the boyfriends were demanding sexual favors from their girlfriends, and girls were giving into that in order to just have simple public displays of affection like holding hands or hugging. So they were actually exchanging sexual favors for simple acts of what we would consider intimacy, like holding hands or something like this. But they were being leveraged because the boys were watching pornography. They thought this is what they should be getting in order to kind of do something. And so again, you have to take faith kind of out of the picture here, because again, if you look at the numbers at which pornography is accessed in Muslim countries or in Muslim populations, you will be shocked. So everybody, we're all the same human beings. We have the same mind. We have the same psychology. In essence, we're all we're all potential victims to the same problem if we don't talk about it.
Yes.
And please, and I really hope, based on what you're hearing here, ask your children, and talk about it, because more than likely they have been exposed to it. And for those children that have already spoken to me about it, I can tell you that they absolutely have. Thank you very much for that engaging conversation. We could go on for hours and hours, I'm sure, but we are running out of time. So we are going to use the remaining time to take questions from our audience. We did have some more questions, and they're very, very pertinent questions, but I don't want to deprive you guys of the opportunity to ask questions in about the 10 or so minutes that we have before Salat al-Isha at 8 o'clock. So we have a microphone. If you feel comfortable asking on the microphone, please feel free just to ask for it. If you would rather not use the microphone, you can let us know as well. But are there any questions that you guys wanted to ask and bring up? We'll start with right here.
Thank you so much for what you said. We learned a lot today. I have a question because I am personally scared of being a bystander. I take the MARTA often when I go to downtown, to GSU. And I sometimes witness things, and I'm in doubt. Are they just arguing, a couple who are arguing? Is she being harassed? And I wonder, what is the best thing to do? What I've done a couple of times is that I look her in the eyes and gesture if she needs any help. But now that you were talking, I don't know if she would be in a safe position if she complains or gestures back to me and says yes. What is the best thing to do? What are the best practices if we think that we're witnessing some type of harassment or violence?
Well, I'll tell you one thing is, first of all, be safe, because if you don't know the parties and you are literally a bystander, you have no connection with them, you never quite know what's going to happen. So you do have to be aware of your physical safety. The other thing is, I find I have tapped somebody on the shoulder and be like, "Are you okay?" Just as simple as that. Like, are you okay? And I don't do it in an accusatory way. I don't do it in I'm saying you are the victim, but it's just a matter of, you look a little upset. Can I do anything to help? And sometimes they're going to be like, screw off, like we don't want to talk to you. And that's fine too. And you have to be willing to do that, right? And you have to be willing to say, okay, you know what, okay, but my ego a little bit bruised, but I will heal in 30 seconds, but at least I tried something.
Exactly.
So that's my suggestion.
No, I agree with you. There was a time when Myra and I had gone to a movie, and we were standing in line at the movie to get popcorn and drink. And there was a couple in front of us, a young couple. And as we were standing there, I noticed how he was talking to her. And he was going on and on with her about how she was acting or something. And I looked at Myra, and Myra looked at me, and I said, I simply tapped him on the shoulder, and I said, brother, I said, could there not be a better way to share what you're feeling and thinking? Is there a better way to talk? And he immediately, he said, hold up, who are you? Listen, you ain't got nothing to do with this. And I said, you're right. I said, but I want you to know that could be my daughter you're talking to. And I'm concerned about her. So it does have something to do with me. And I just left it. I just left it. The thing is that I don't know what may have happened for him in that moment. But the fact that I said something may, in that moment or later on, make a difference.
Right, and I do think it stops the momentum, right? Like, that interruption does stop the momentum.
Energy, it does.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is regarding when, like, people who are considered like Islamic scholars or imams, they, commit certain acts. And we've heard of this happening. It's happened recently. I guess I just wanted to just ask, like, what would be your recommendations as far as like what masajid should do to prevent such things from happening?
Please.
Oh, wow. What can masajid do? I don't know that as an institution, I would say a masjid needs to do X, Y, or Z. I think we as individuals need to do something, right? That accountability. The masjid is just 4 walls and a roof. It's the people that really make the institution. So I would say it needs to be an individual response. And frankly, if you see somebody in a position of power abusing someone, and that person is in a position of power over us, I think we need to stand up and say, no, that's not okay. That's not okay. And I think it's really important. I know that there are certain, sometimes we develop, obviously we want to respect people who are in a position of power over us. I get that. And we want to care for them, we want to be supportive of them. But at the same time, I think it's really important as an audience to recognize how difficult it is for somebody who's been victimized to come forward and to not immediately say, you're making this up and he must be telling the truth because he's the person in a position of power. So I think as an institution, it's really important for us, all of us, to not necessarily always jump to the defense of the person we know because he's in a position of power versus the one we don't know who is taking this big step to say, I have been victimized. Because I promise you, I know there are lots of us women who are drama queens, but I don't care how much attention a woman wants. She's not generally going to make up a story like that and come out in front of everyone she knows and say, this happened to me just to get attention. So I think we need to be very, very cognizant of what it takes for a victim to come forward. And at the same time to hold our leaders accountable for what they do.
Exactly. Can I maybe add to this? One very important factor of this, especially in the Muslim community, is to really understand the dynamics of the relationship that's appropriate between a religious leader and you as a congregant. It's very, very, very important to know that. There is a website called In Shaykh's Clothing, right? In Shaykh's Clothing. You can look this up. And this website actually came about because of abuse that was being reported in the Muslim community. And so they're detailing, look, what is appropriate behavior for an imam or a religious scholar or a religious guide to display, and what is inappropriate behavior? What is the kind of interaction that is acceptable? What is the kind of interaction that is not acceptable? And I think we need to do a better job, and we need to be very clear about how we are interacting with each other. And the moment, look, religious, like you mentioned, any position of power, and I can tell you this because I sit in the chair of an imam, and I can tell you this. It has influence. It has a lot of influence. And so, but the moment you feel that there's something that's being done that's inappropriate is a time to step away from that situation. And so there are resources that are available. In Shaykh's Clothing is one of those resources that you guys can look up and tend to. But really being self-empowered to know, the religion is not just in the hands of the religious scholar, right? Islam is for everybody. And so the study of Islam is for everybody. And so the normal dynamics of that normal relationship should be something every single person is aware of, and we should maybe do maybe a better job of explaining that to our congregants, very, very as part of a transparency policy. And I know I saw a hand back there for a question. Yes, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Domestic violence is not only between husband and wife. It also goes the other way around. Also, there is male being violated their rights and by their wife. Also, there is elderly abuse. Yes. There is also sibling abuse that goes in the community, and especially in the Muslim community, there is a lot of elderly abuse. And we really need to talk about that because sometimes it's a taboo. And if we are not talking about it, it's very going to be problematic to address the issue. And this will go so deep, and then it will be difficult to save that life.
Right.
So what I'm saying is how much work has been done in the other way around, which is the siblings abuse, the elderly abuse, also the male being abused.
Right. Well, I will say, as far as men being abused, it is absolutely something that happens. And I am very aware that sometimes I tend to use, generalize that the victim is always female. That's absolutely not true. There are male victims of domestic violence, both partner violence and, elder abuse. There is absolutely elder abuse, sibling abuse. But I can say that NFS, for example, has several male clients, actually, who we support and provide services to. So that is absolutely recognized, right? Now, as far as the issue of elder abuse and the issue of sibling abuse or any violence within a family, what it boils down to really is, again, power and control. Anytime you have somebody who has less power and somebody else who wields power over them, there is the potential for abuse, and it happens all the time. And I have to be very honest, it's not something that's ever been brought to us, right? I have never seen it, not because it doesn't happen, but because we don't talk about it. So I think it's obligatory for all of us to also recognize that just because I tend to talk about husbands, abusing their wives, that's not the end-all, be-all of family violence. Exactly. Absolutely not. And there's elder abuse, there's in-law abuse. I mean, there's all kinds of abuse. So if you're seeing it happening, certainly refer them to us. We would be happy to help. I'm sure Men Stopping Violence would be happy to assist. And there's so many organizations that work on that. And they're actually state-run organizations specifically for elder abuse. So there are a lot of resources that are out there. I think one of the reasons, just to put that out there, one of the reasons we don't see so much sibling abuse is because of defects involvement, because they're state agencies. So with minor children, they often tend to get involved and it doesn't get to us. But certainly I think we need to be aware of it and talk about it.
One piece to add. I want to say that I know that we don't live with angels and we don't live with saints.
That's true.
I know women do things. If you come by the home I live in, you're not going to see no halo over it. Okay? What I learned years ago, though, is that there's only one side of the street that Sulaiman is responsible for, and that's my side. And what I've learned is that if I work hard to keep my side of the street squeaky clean, I eventually see a street sweeper coming on the other side. You see, we are leaders in our homes. How are we leading? How are we modeling? How are we demonstrating what it is to have a safe relationship? How are we modeling for the little people in our lives? How are we showing up for our children? What are they learning from us? What it is to be a man, what it is to be a father, what it is to be a husband? Because at some point, men, they're going to take you into a relationship. At some point in time, that's where it's going to show up at. So while I know women may do things, what I say to you is that we have a responsibility. If you're in a relationship and it's not healthy, seek help. It's okay to ask for help. Counsel, therapy, imam, seek help. Don't feel like I got to take care of this myself. I got to make it right. I got to do all it. No, we don't have all the answers. Sometimes you can't fix it. And it's okay. Because we've been put in a world where we have a lot of help available to us. Yeah. However, you have to acknowledge it.
Absolutely.
Great question, sis. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much, guys. We are short on time. We do have to continue the rest of the program we have with Shaykh Yaser Birjas, inshallah, after Salatul Isha. We will have Salatul Isha first. I know our speakers, they may stick around for a little bit, so if you're still here, you still have questions, I'm sure they'd be happy,
Sure.
unless I'm putting you on the spot.
No, I'm open.
Engage with you guys. Thank you very much for this conversation tonight. We could go on for this about this for hours, I'm sure. We didn't get to all of your questions, but the guests will be around, inshallah, after the prayer to take your questions individually. Jazakallah khair. Thank you guys very much for being a good audience, and inshallah we'll have the prayer now. We ask the men to inshallah fill up the space in the musalla, and the women will open the doors. If you guys can utilize the space from the front back here, inshallah, because we do have a lot of people in the building today. And we are going to go and break now for Salatul Isha. Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. And one more time, thank you to our guests. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا